Of you are suffering badly from jet lag, but you will be awakened, I'm sure, by the comments this afternoon. And I'm glad we see lots of students here this afternoon as well. We have a very interesting session that deals with questions related to societies who are divided by what we call ethno-national divide. We have two speakers I'll introduce in a second, but one of the very big challenges, of course, in divided societies is to what extent the schism or the divisions are also related to different nationalist claims, because the very essence of a nationalist claim is that people who regard themselves as distinctive ask for this distinctiveness to be represented in a sovereign state. So the very essence of what we'll hear today is to what extent it is even possible to talk about states which are multinational, in the sense that states themselves who are claiming to be representing nations can have conflicting claims, but to what extent they can really coexist. And this will be the tenor, I guess, of our discussion today. And we are privileged to have with us two distinguished scholars, Alfred Stepan and Astrid von Busekist. I will introduce first, I guess, Alfred is opening. I have the privilege of knowing Professor Stepan for many years, and his contribution to our field are well known to many of you. His works on military civic relations in Latin America, his works on democratization from the breakdown series to the consolidation series, his many other essays and works on comparative politics in general, and now in the last few years his immense research project into the twin toleration, as it's known, the question of religiosity in international politics and in the domain of democracy, how we do it. And in that respect, we are here for a treat to listen to Professor Stepan. On my left, we are honored to have Astrid de Busekist, who is also a visiting professor this year here from the Sciences Po, who has written extensively on the subject of ethnicity, nationalism, identities, and has done her work on the subject of, among other things, of Belgium, a country that many of us perhaps know not much, but is a very important one because of the division that exists there. And she will highlight one of the more interesting issues, is to what extent, indeed, constitutions are contributing to cohesion, or to what extent they are leading to ruptures. And that will be the case of Astrid. So without further ado, I'm really delighted to chairing the session, and we will begin with Professor Stepan. Please.
Thank you, Yossi. We overlapped at Yale, so it's really great. And then I want to thank the organizers. We overlapped at Columbia, and I hope I overlap with everyone as we go on. He's absolutely right. I'm going to address this question. Can we expand our imaginations or repertoires of how we possibly can manage deeply divided societies, how we can manage them in such a way that it contributes somewhat more to social peace than you would have had, and possibly even democracies. And now, of course, all independent democratic states have a degree of cultural diversity. But for comparative purposes, we can say that at any given time, states may be divided analytically into three different categories. One, and this is the one I'm going to focus on most, states that have strong cultural diversity, some of which is territorially based and politically articulated by significant groups and leaders that, in the name of nationalism and self-determination, advance claims of independence. Two, states that are quite culturally diverse, but whose diversity is nowhere organized by territorially based, politically significant groups mobilizing nationalist claims for independence. And three, states in which a community, sufficiently culturally homogeneous to consider itself a nation, dominates the state, and no other significant group articulates similar claims. Okay? Now, in the forthcoming book called Democracy in Multinational societies, Indian Other Polities, that I've co-written with Juan Linz, which I've been often co-writing with him for about 30 years, and a new co-author, Yogendra Yadav, who's a colleague of Rajiv's at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, and an amazingly brilliant person in many ways, but particularly he's probably one of the great public opinion pollers, I think way better than the University of Michigan group, and his samples are larger, his questions are more sociologically inventive, and so I was thrilled that when he asked me to do questions on religion and identity in a 31,000 person sample, and then we did booster samples in many other cases. All right. Now, in that book, we use a phrase, politically robustly multinational, big mouthful. That's simply to say, not just multicultural, but this is a state where there are more than one group who sees itself as a nation and has leaders for independence. So automatically, who's in that set? Well, at the very least, if we're talking about countries that are relatively long-standing democracies, Canada, because of the Quebecois, certainly Spain, because of Basque and Catalonia, and India at various times for, obviously, Kashmir and Nagaland, Mizoram, the Punjab, and between the 20s to the 50s, Dravidistan, which was the south of India. So it has had many. And to a smaller extent, Belgium occasionally at times has this. Okay, that's politically robustly multinational. Switzerland and the United States are both sociologically diverse and multicultural, but it's a totally different thing to say it's multicultural, to say they handle these types of problems because they don't have to address them, because they don't have people who are trying to organize for independence. It may happen if things change. If Mexico develops 5 times faster than New Mexico, all the people down in New Mexico say, hey, we were stolen, let's go and join. So it can happen. It can be socially constructed. But at the moment, there's nothing there that exists. And there are some countries like Japan, Portugal, and most of the Scandinavian countries that fall into the third category. Okay. Now, one of the things that we just say, what are the political implications of these 3 different categories, particularly the first one? One of the political implications is that if you're in a situation, well, for all 3 of these, if at the time of inauguration of competitive elections, a polity only has one significant group which sees itself as a nation, and there exists a relatively common sense of history and religion, and a shared language throughout the territory, nation-state building and democracy building can be mutually reinforcing logics. However, in a situation where you are politically robustly multinational, there's more than one nation talking about independence, nation-state building and democracy building tend to be conflicting logics because one of those nations is going to be marginalized. And that's just it. If you're using those categories. Now, we're just trying to address in our book, how can we expand the repertoire of ways of dealing with difficulties like this. There's one thing that we spent a very long chapter on called Federacies. I'm not going to go into that today, but I'll just say what it is, Federacies. It's not federations, it's Federacies. And that is, we only use that category for unitary states. But a unitary state that has some part of it that is so different linguistically, historically, in their self-perception, their economy, that it can't really fit into a unitary state and a nation-state model. Well, one of the things that's happened is you've made some of those the federal types of relationships only for that part of the otherwise unitary state. So there are about 15 of them in the world. The ones that are most important, well, for me right now, the one that was just negotiated 27 months ago in Aceh, which terminated the civil war in Indonesia. And I talked to both people on site. Without a federacy formula, it would have been impossible. Other ones are obviously Greenland for Denmark, the South Tyrol, and the South Tyrol, the Aloe Islands. So there's many of the ones that we could talk about. Okay. I'm not going to go into that if there are questions. Now, the focus here is going to be on nation-state versus state-nation issue. Linz and I and Yogendra believe when we really thought about the political histories of Canada, of Spain, of India, if you had, all of which had politically robust multinational dimensions, if you had insisted on a hard Third Republic, 19th century French idea of a nation state, that these would not be relatively peaceful democracies. And because all of them had some territorially based linguistic cultural cleavage that had already been activated. So the question really is on people facing us is whether to attempt to repress these existing differences or accommodate. And in that sense, the theory of nation-state as an ideal type really doesn't give you much thought about how you can accommodate. As a matter of fact, if we just take as ideal type what we're going to call nation-state and what we call state-nation, there are 5 dimensions that they're really, as ideal types, are virtually polar opposites. Pre-existing conditions in a nation-state, some concerning we-ness, awareness of an attachment to one major cultural civilization tradition. This cultural identity corresponds to existing state boundaries with minor exceptions. State-nation, right from the beginning, is different. It's awareness of an attachment to more than one cultural civilization within the existing boundaries. However, these attachments do not preclude identification with a common state. State cultural policies in a nation-state is try and homogenize it. In a state-nation, it's recognize and support some of these differences, but be working all the time to create some common polity-wide symbols so that it's unity and diversity. Characteristic institutions, and here I'm a comparativist, political scientist, unitary states and mononational symmetrical federations. Symmetrical federations are simply every constituent unit has the same rights and obligations. In asymmetrical, they don't. That's the whole reason. They may have some differences that they're going to fight for, and you're going to respond to it in some way. You respond to certain, it can be, the easiest ones are language, but there can be other ones. All right? So they're in state-nation, it's a federal system, often de jure or de facto asymmetrical. It can even be a unitary state if everyone is aware that you're going to blow up a unitary state if you try hard French tactics. We've got a chapter on Ukraine. We're absolutely convinced that if they had tried hard nation-state policies, Ukrainian language only, what happened to Georgia would have already happened to the Ukraine. Russia would have invaded it. Because overwhelming in the eastern Ukraine, there's a feeling that they still want to speak Russian, and there's a Russian feeling there. So you just have to respond to it not in a nation-state way. Ethnocultural territorial cleavages, they're not too salient in a nation-state, and they're salient but recognized and democratically managed in a state-nation. Autonomist or secessionist parties, in a nation-state, autonomous parties are normally not coalitionable. And secessionist parties are outlawed or marginalized in democratic electoral politics. In a state-nation, autonomous parties can govern in federal units and are coalitionable at the center. Nonviolent secessionist parties can sometimes participate in the democratic political process. All of this would be an anathema in a nation-state. Citizen orientation towards political identity. Nation-state, single identity as citizens of the state and overwhelmingly as members of the same cultural institution. State-nation, and this is crucial, multiple but complementary identities. It's not only simply multiple, but it's complementary. Obedience and loyalty, nation-state, obedience to the state and loyalty to the nation. State-nation, obedience to the state and identification with institutions, neither based on single national identity. Okay. We assert in our book that if a polity is close to being, that was the ideal type categories. We're saying if a polity is close to being a state-nation, empirically, it should have the following 4 characteristics. And you should be able to investigate this, do research on it, and demonstrate it. Okay? These are, first, despite multiple cultural identities among the citizens of the polity, there will be at the same time a high degree of positive identification with the state and a high pride in being citizens of that state. Second, Citizens of the state will have multiple but complementary political identities and loyalties. Third, there'll be a high degree of institutional trust in the most important constitutional, legal, and administrative components of the state. Fourth, by world standards, there will be a comparatively high degree of positive support for democracy among all the diverse groups of the polity. But obviously, Yugoslavia wouldn't hit, at the end, wouldn't hit any of these, right? So people confuse it with this. But this is, is it possible to get all of this and not get Yugoslavia, not get the fragmentation? So some people say, look, any experiment like this will lead to Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Is this right, or is this another instance of tyranny of the last instance? I suggest if we're really thinking, because I say any form of ethno-federalism leads to disintegration. But all of these four countries have an element of ethno-federalism in it. So we can't totally accept the Yugoslav and the Russian example. We have to, in the back of our mind, and we do it in the book, say, why did they disintegrate and why didn't these, even though there's some tendencies? I mean, the easiest possible thing is they have to be close to the nation state. Linz and I are not against, and Yadav are not against nation states. We're saying, if you're not one, how does one respond to it? So a lot of places are not one. If China ever became independent, became a democracy, is it going to be a nation state in a real sense, or is it going to have to respond to the Tibetans? So it's there, and to deny it doesn't help. Now, then, how can such state-nation-like patterns and behaviors be fostered and supported? And here I'm going to do something that it almost sounds too intellectual for a Lynn Stepan Yadav thing, but we think that there is a grammar that is almost counterintuitive, but it holds together, and you're going to have to use all these components of this grammar. This will help you build a state-nation. And we call it a nested policy grammar. And by calling these nested, we mean to say that each is more likely to be implemented if the one preceding it had been adopted also, or adopted first. The policies are as follows. Eventually, this could be up to half the world's population, so it's not just an academic exercise. Well, half the world's population, India helps a lot, right? An asymmetrical holding together federal state, but not a symmetrical coming together federal state or a unitary state. Individual rights and collective recognition. Parliamentary instead of presidential or semi-presidential systems. Polity-wide and centric regional parties and careers. Politically integrated but not culturally assimilated populations. Cultural nationalists in power mobilizing against secession nationalists. An earned pattern of complementary and multiple identities. Every single one of these assertions is a 4-hour argument with colleagues like Ernest Gellner and so on. Every single one of these is against a pretty classical, individual, liberal-oriented, which I'm not against, but you're going to have to use other approaches, too, to get into this. Why probably an asymmetrical holding together federal state? Well, a federal rather than a unitary state is part of the nested grammar because federal state structures allow a large territorially concentrated cultural group with some serious secessionist nationalist aspirations and possibly a language of their own to attain self-government within that territory. So that's really important. They can rule themselves in that territory. And if they're very, very different, it's going to be asymmetrical. It's not going to be federal, it's going to be asymmetrical. You can't do that in a unitary state. So this is self-government for a very large group. Some of the states like Tamil Nadu, which I'll talk about later, 45 million people. This is in the south, near Dravidistan. It was part of the old Dravidistan. Okay. Now, then, why individual rights and collective recognition? I got a huge amount of flack about this. Brian Barry just died over this. The polity would not be democratic unless throughout the polity individual rights are constitutionally inviolable and state protected. I mean, we're absolutely insistent on that. So this necessary function of the center cannot be devolved. However, in Chuck Taylor's sense, some territorially concentrated cultural groups, even nations, may need some collective recognition for rights beyond classic liberal rights, or what Michael Walzer calls liberalism 2. For members of some groups to thrive culturally and even possibly to exercise fully their classical individual rights. When they finally get their rights, their individual rights, but the battle for it, and it may be a 50-year battle on social organization. You win it. You fight over it, whether it's feminist rights or rights for Turks, Kurds in Turkey. At a moment, for a while, you're fighting for a collective good. Once you get it, it's an individual one. But I don't think we should just absolutely be against any sort of collective goods. Why a parliamentary instead of a presidential or semi-presidential system? What?
405.
Okay. Why a parliament? Because a presidential and a semi-presidential is an indivisible good. It's one person. It's a president. A parliamentary coalition can be. There are 24 parties in one of the recent governments in India, and those parties are different nationalities, different languages, and so on. So a parliamentary system can be coalition requiring and coalition sustaining. Presidential is neither. Why polywide and centric regional parties and careers? If parties get all their votes from one group in the literature, from one region, and the literature says that's secessionist. However, if in fact they're in alliance at the center with the governing party and they help make it, and the party at the center helps them form a majority in their place, you don't want. They're no longer secessionist parties. They're they're centric regional parties, and we need a category for that. Why and how not culturally assimilated, but nonetheless politically integrated? If this polity has put a roof of rights over your head, you can, and you're working and you're forming governments and you're getting ministers, you're part of that system, but you're still not culturally integrated. So many people like Ernest feel you have to be. He says a good democracy is a bowl, right? Cultural bowl supporting the political bowl. That metaphor is just deeply misleading for thinking about problems like this. Why cultural nationalists in power will normally mobilize against secessionist nationalists? Another impossibility. People say all cultural nationalists are interested in autonomy. Look, if you're running a state of 50 million in your own language and you're controlling all the ministries and the educational ministry and that, then you begin to think, in the case of India, that you're just a member of the European Union. You have a nation state in your own state, but you're also a member of something larger. Okay. Three quick points on how intense is the diversity in India. It's really big. In terms of, people talk about languages. In India at independence, in addition to the largest single language, Hindi, which Uganda argues was only spoken by less than 40% of the population, 10 different languages, Telugu, Bengali, Marathi, Tamil, Urdu, Gujarati, Kannada, Malayalam, and Oriya were each spoken between 32 to 13 million people. That's independence. Double all those sizes now. Right now there are 22 official languages. Okay? Secondly, religious. India, he said there were 120 million Muslims. I Googled it. They're now saying it's 135 million Muslims. As
of this morning.
Yeah, as of this morning, right. So it is the second largest concentration of Muslims in the world. Only Indonesia is larger. Pakistan's close. But depending on how you look at it. What? Bangladesh, they're in a set. If you want to, you can say they're in a set. But I mean, this is serious. And okay. And poverty, of the four multinational federal democracies, India's the only one that's not an advanced country. Canada, 33,000, 2005 per capita income. Canada, 33,000. Belgium, 32. Spain, 27. India, 4,000. So how does it do it? That's hard. This is really, there are a lot of bad things. The literacy rate of women is nearly 50%. The report on the status of Muslims was pretty shocking. And 22% of all the citizens live in great poverty. 1% of the Muslims do. But if you then, nonetheless, it's impressive that the countries hold together. Is a democracy. It's very impressive. And on the criteria that I said, pride, of the 12 federal democracies in the world, it has the third highest pride again and again and again, both in the world values and so on. And 67% of Indians express great pride in being Indian, a figure exceeded only by chauvinist Americans at 71% and chauvinist Australians at 70%. If the question is trust in the central government, crucial for the Yugoslavian, Russian type of question, trust in the central government. Okay, you get someplace like Tamil Nadu, who was at independence, was talking about the major leader burned burned the flag of independence. 3 years later, he burned the Constitution when it was published. India has more trust in this. Only Switzerland has more trust in the central government than India. Switzerland has 50%. We've got our problems with it, Switzerland. And India, 48%. Okay? A classic question is battery questions on democracy. I'll just say that it's only in my first 3 or 4 books were on Latin America. It pains me to say that in the last 10 years, only the question on the battery of support for democracy, and you can do negative ones. Do you want an authoritarian government? Do you want, this? Any way you look at it, support in democracy in the 20 countries in Latin America, only 2 of them are higher than India, and that's Costa Rica and Uruguay. And it's overwhelmingly higher than Chile, overwhelmingly higher than South Korea, and so on. So it's rather interesting. Okay, then a question of religion. We've been talking about this. What he said, what I'm saying is interesting. It's a form of support all religion. Financially support all religion, financially recognize it. I know hardly anyone in this room likes it, but only the United States and Israel are you as fundamentalists on this issue. If you want to know that 25 democracies in Europe, 100% of them give funding for religious schools, religious education standard is 76%, government collects taxes for religious organizations in 52%. I'm not saying I like this, I'm just saying this is the world. So if we're going to call, and every Scandinavian country, of course, has established church. Is established evangelical church. So we have to be a little cautious when we just jump into this. Okay, in India, okay, this table is hard to see, but I didn't want to do PowerPoint. But basically, with Yogendra, we did a question. He asked me to do the questions on religious identity and support for democracy, and a whole series of them. Okay, so we created a index, 3-part index of support for democracy, and a 3-part index for religious intensity of religious practice. Okay? Our findings for Hindus. The greater the intensity of religious practice, and it's huge, the greater the support for democracy. Okay? Finding for Muslims. I was nervous about this because if I came up with the greater the intensity of religious practice, the less the support for democracy, people didn't have to quote Sam Huntington anymore. They could quote Stepan, a better source, a bit larger sample, right? So my hands were sweaty when I saw the result. Findings. The greater the intensity of religious practice by Muslims in India, the greater the intensity of support for democracy. And it's the same for Christians, and it's the same for Sikhs. Now, that's part of this support all religion, recognize all religion. When I say some of those things travels, it does travel. For example, every single nation-state in Western Europe has some paid compulsory public holidays for majority Christian religions. For example, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Germany alone have 39 paid compulsory holidays but every single one of them is for Christian religion. It's 0, 0, 0 in Western Europe for any non-Christian religion. Okay, what's India do? And what does every single Muslim democracy in the world, and the 0 Arab democracies, but there are a lot of Muslim majorities, not a lot, 7 or 8, 5, 6 good ones. What do? They all follow the Indian model. By that I mean the Indian model is India has 5 such holidays for the majority language, but 10 for minority religions, including 4 for Islam. Almost as many for Islam as they have for Hinduism. Indonesia has 6 for Muslims and 5 for Buddhist, Christians, and so on. Senegal, with only 10% Catholic population, has 5 and 4. And they pay for pilgrimages to Rome. Not to London. My wife's in London. Okay. But they pay. So this is, we have to really, this is. Yeah, no. Oh, and India pays for the Hajj. So even the fundamentalist BJP government wouldn't dare violate that principle of Indian reciprocity and recognition of not paying for the Hajj. The 3rd biggest airport there is it. So I'll just finish very quickly that if you, the language, I did a match pair. It's about 120 pages in the book. We take 2 cases and apply the language to them. One, how India treats Tamils in South India, and that was where there was secessionist, and so on. They burned the constitution, their leader, and so on. So that was a real potential problem at independence. And Sri Lanka, which hadn't had a riot between Tamils and Sinhalese for 100 years before independence was everyone's picture book on good development. We all had to study development studies, Sri Lanka as the best democracy in the developing world and so on. What happens? 20 years after independence, secessionism in Tamil Nadu, India, is a total non-issue. And 20 years after independence in Sri Lanka, you've got the Cambodian killing fields. Okay. Much of the difference explained in that variation is, did they use the language, this nested language? India used every part of the nested language. First choice, federalism. Second choice, parliamentarianism. Third choice, multiple parties, etc. Sri Lanka went from recognizing 3 languages to only recognizing 1. Within 15 years of that, there were no Tamils above the rank of captain in the army or the police. And so you're just gone. Then they made you pledge allegiance to the unitary state of Sri Lanka, and everyone stood up. Everyone from northwest Sri Lanka stood up, put their hand down, and walked out. Every single person walked out, and there hasn't been a legislator from the Tamil area of Sri Lanka since 1984. It's a total polarization. So all the young guys went out and created the guerrilla group. So this is a politically created polarization of something. Sri Lanka wasn't even a politically robust multinational country. It was a diverse country, but it wasn't because they weren't asking for it. They didn't really have an independence movement very strong. And the leader of it, the leader of the Congress Party, is a Tamil from the north in the 30s. So the first request for federalism isn't until 10 years after independence. So you sociologically create a war in one case from peace, and you sociologically create peace from a lot of conflict. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alfred. We heard so many things, but one variable which I'm sure will be well studied is how to somewhat stymie conflict by vacation. So it's certainly a very interesting notion of vacation holidays, and I think you're into something here. Astrid, are you ready? Yeah. So our next presentation is by Professor Busekist. Please.
Now that Al has done the hardcore stuff, I will do the practical application and talk about Belgium. I have a handout here which might be easy. I also did a PowerPoint. I'm sorry, Al, but I thought this would be easier for me. So I'm going to talk about Belgium. Is Belgium a deeply divided society? I wouldn't say so, but it is a divided society. And after 150 years of struggle, of debate by subnational groups, Belgium has engaged into a federalization process. This is just a map. I will get back to this in a oops, I don't need this one. I'll get back to this in a minute. So what I would like to show is that the constitutional revisions in Belgium were tailored to accommodate the 2 main communities, the Flemish and the Walloons, in the north and in the south, and to pacify the tensions between the 2 groups. So the change of the constitution, there was a Belgian constitution, obviously, but there has been a revision in order to federalize the Belgian unitarian state. And this was to pacify the tensions between the 2 main national, subnational, linguistic communities, groups in the north and in the south. Both communities thought that federalization would be the solution to, that federalization would be the solution to pacify the tensions, but also to accommodate individual and collective rights better than in the Unitarian setting. Paradoxally, this is not at all what has happened, and the federal institutions created very, very many frictions, very much more frictions between the 2 groups, and in my view contributed, and data shows that I'm right, contributed to tear the 2 communities even more apart. Belgium was a consociational democracy before, and I would argue that it is not anymore today. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. For those who don't know Belgium that much, I will do a short overview of the Belgian recent history and the constitutional revisions. There's a handout that probably has been passed around, which is good for the chronology of the different revisions, because there's been many of them, at least 4 between 1970 and 1993-94. The consequences of Belgium has not only become a federal state, it also has become a very unique federal state with a very unique architecture, federal architecture. And this unique architecture and the dynamics of this architecture had disastrous results on the Belgian society, at least on the cohesion of the Belgian society. And then I will shortly, if I have time, say some words about consociationalism in Belgium, and thanks to Professor Osbodun, I will not have to go into details because we've already talked about them. Okay, now Belgium was created in 1830, as a constitutional French-speaking Unitarian monarchy. Shortly after the creation of the state, there has been a very strong Flemish national movement, which demanded, which was patriotic in its essence, but demanded claim for linguistic rights, cultural rights for the Flemish community in the north. And there has been many laws officially recognizing Flanders specificity as a second official language only in 1935. So after 100 years, there have been many battles. Language has been definitely territorialized after World War II in 1963, after very severe riots in Brussels. I will explain this a little later on. And these are only the main dates that I think we should remember. And one of the baddest language, this is normative legislation, took place in 1988, where the federal state decided that there would be no longer compulsory training of the second language of the state for either group, which means basically that the Flemings still speak French, but the French, of course, the French-speaking community, the Walloons, don't speak Flemish anymore. So this slide also to explain that language policy has been the main source of debate in Belgium, and that language, Al talked about this and Rajiv talked about this a little bit earlier, language has been the main crystallizing object within political debate in Belgium. Everything can be seen through language, and most of the literature insists on the language battles between the North and the South. I don't believe this is true anymore, but language still serves as a very practical alibi today to make the difference between the two communities. So now struggle between the two communities, also about social justice, but I will get to this in a minute. So what did Belgium decide, and how did Belgium shift from free? I also frame it as a language issue because it was true before the federalization. How did Belgium shift from this free individual language choice, which existed in the former constitution, to constraining territorial federalism, unilingualism with two strong nationalisms facing each other, preventing, although the federalization, democratic vivre ensemble in my sense, but also social justice and interregional economic solidarity, which might be the most important feature of the Belgian battle today. Okay, let me go on. Okay, this is just to follow what Al said and what Professor Osbodun said a little earlier. Unlike Switzerland, for instance, the cleavages between the North and the South, the Flemings and the Walloons do overlap in Belgium. You have a rich Catholic agricultural North, represented by the Christian Democrats in almost every election, and a socialist, industrial, relatively poor, impoverished at least South, mainly represented by the Socialist Party, and still very strong unions today. Now, my claim is that in Belgium today you have two micro-democracies which coexist in Flanders and in Wallonia, bounded by linguistic frontiers, but there is Brussels right in the middle. Brussels is in Flemish territory, as you can see here, and there are many special laws concerning the linguistic legislation of the towns around Brussels. But I will get to this in a minute. Okay, so that 1, 2 micro-democracies of their own, bounded by linguistic frontiers, I just said that, and with very little communication and solidarity between the two. And what was meant to be a new start after an unhappy marriage was, in fact, not a catastrophe, but was the dynamics that the federalization set free was probably had the opposite effect of what it was supposed to achieve. And I believe that you can achieve a very fine constitutional architecture, what the Belgians did, and still fail politically and socially. And I think this is true for Belgium. So maybe I can. Okay, so I tried to come up with a little graph. On the left-hand side column, I put the general features of federalism, and on the right-hand side, Belgium. And maybe I can run you through this just in a minute. But beforehand, I would say one thing about the first constitutional revision, 1970, which set the whole dynamics free, and in which Belgium has created two types of new institutions: regions and cultural communities. The problem is that the regions and the cultural communities do not overlap in the south of the country. They only overlap in the north. So the Flemings, the community and the region, the Flemish-speaking community and the Flemish region overlap in the north, and they don't. So the governments and the parliaments are the same, and they don't in the south. In Brussels, the Brussels Assembly is paritarian. Okay. So the two institutions, regions and communities and region, those are the two new creations of the 1970 revision. And I would just like to highlight 2 or 3 maybe novelties in that revision. One, in the first revision, parity was created within the central government. So there's the same number of Flemish and Walloon ministers, except for the prime minister, within the government. 2, a number of special laws can only be issued if 2/3 of each community agree with that law. And thirdly, there has been what the Belgians call the alarm bell, which is the veto system actually, that if one community feels threatened, they can ring the alarm bell, and then the law has to pass another. It's a recourse procedure, and the law has to go through a second reading. This is on the central level. On the federal level, and that's interesting too, I believe, the communities are not labeled as national or ethnic communities. They're labeled as language communities. So it's not the Dutch community or the Flemish community and the Walloon community. It's the French-speaking community and the Flemish-speaking and the German-speaking community. So language also was translated into the new federal architecture, and the communities are language communities. Lastly, the federalization has created a plurilegislative setting in which the federal entities and the central state have almost the same rights, and that creates some problems. Now, knowing this, if you have a look at this graph, in most of the federations, you have one general federal architecture a priori, like in the United States, for instance. In Belgium, you have a permanent aggiornamento, which is not over yet, which has started in the 70s and was technically over in 1994 with the last rewriting of the constitution, but the Belgians still tailor it a little bit every year or every other year. Okay, so that's one. So Rajiv said this is interesting because it could be a favorable feature. It could be the ambiguity you talked about, and it's also about the importance of context because the dynamics, of course, are different according to the political majority and to the context. In Belgium, I think that these dynamics have created more insecurity than fruitful ambiguity, and I think this also contributed to tear the two parts of the country apart. Okay, in most of the federations, you have an association federalism, like in Germany, in peaceful democracies, as in Germany, in Switzerland, also in maybe even in Spain, less so in Spain. In Belgium, you have a dissociation federalism and a bipolar federalism because the agendas simply don't overlap in the Flemish part and in the Walloon part. Okay. The electoral cycles are also dissociated between the north and the south, which creates many problems. Graph line 4, you have asymmetrical federalism. You just talked about this, whereas in most settings you have symmetrical federalism. In Belgium, it's very asymmetrical. In other words, it doesn't make sense to talk about regional or communitarian competences in Belgium because none of the regions or communities have the same rights in Belgium. The Flemish Parliament, for instance, carries out all the competences of the Flemings, whereas the French speakers and the Brussels inhabitants have hinge upon at least 3 different governments, parliaments, and so forth. 3, you have a double federalism in Belgium. We talked about this. It's territorial, geographical, but it's also personal for those who live in Brussels, for instance. We all know what territorial federalism is. In Brussels, it's personal federalism. In other words, it's about individual rights and not rights that are linked to the territory you live on. So regardless of geographical location in Brussels, you can get services from the state in either language, for instance. Okay, the functional cooperation. I won't go into this for the moment. But another interesting feature of Belgium federalism is international federalism. In other words, the regions and the communities have international competences. They represent Belgium outside and they can sign international treaties. And this leads me to the next line, the federal representation at the EU. For instance, in the lawmaking process at the European Commissions, alternatively, the Flemish and the Walloons are represented, which is not a real problem. The real problem is the implementation of the European law within Belgium, because Belgium as a state is reliable, but the communities apply the laws in the north and in the south, and that's an interesting feature. And the law is not the same for all in Belgium and the 2 sides of the federation. Okay, and then there's the question of the capital, which is located in Flanders, although it is French-speaking. Brussels is 85% of French speakers, but it's in Flanders, and in the last few years, there has been many fights about the surrounding towns of Brussels in which there's a bilingual status, but the Flemish think that shouldn't be because it's in Flemish territory. When the linguistic boundary was finally set, it was set after, until 1963, there was a linguistic poll. So according to the linguistic poll, the boundary of the between Flanders and Wallonia shifted, because there was within the population census, there was a question on mother tongue and on language. Okay, so this, after riots in Brussels, this line was taken out of the population census, and they divided also the universities, most of the universities, into two linguistic branches of the universities, and namely Louvain. And they did such a wonderful and fair job that they also divided the libraries of the university, which was very painful for me, who did my dissertation on Belgium, because they divided also the reviews, and they put the odd years into Wallonia and the even years of the reviews into Flanders. So you had to travel back and forth to get the whole review.
We should have used Al's vacation plan.
Yeah. Okay, so consociational democracy. Is Belgium still this was one of my other arguments, but Furnival is known to the comparatists among us who worked on Asia, Burma, and Indonesia. Al knows him, of course, and I would argue that Belgium is not a consociational society anymore, but more a plural society, and this is one of the definitions that Furnival gives. He says it's a business partnership in which to many partners bankruptcy signifies release rather than disaster, and that's exactly what the Flemish would think, because as I said before, what the Flemish do not want to do anymore is foot the bill of the Walloon economy, because the Walloon side is very much poorer than the Flemish side is. Okay, why is Belgium not a consociational society anymore, despite of the numbers of yes in column 2? This is just you all know this. This is Leipold, column 1, and I tried to answer all the question and all the items that Leipold gives in column 2. So there's a lot of yeses with some restrictions. Power sharing is yes, that's important. Veto, yes. Accommodation, yes, with some restrictions for the German-speaking community. I still believe it's not a consociational democracy anymore for at least 3 reasons. One, there are no national parties anymore. So you have Christian Democrats in the north and in the south, not with the same audience. You have them, but their agendas are not the same anymore because there's no national committee of these parties anymore, one. So that there are also no dominant parties anymore as there were before. The governments at the federal and the regional level are not congruent anymore, so you can have 2 different governments and 3 different levels within each of the region. You have an ongoing electoral campaign because of this, because the electoral cycles are dissociated between the federal and the central level, plus the growing electoral mobility, which is not specific to Belgium. So, in short, and something else, which I think is important also, that in the previous setting, before the federalization, the parties had to compromise before. There were coalitions a priori. Now there are coalitions a posteriori. And so the voters, according to the polls, always think that there's a hidden agenda because they don't know anything about the future coalitions before the election. Plus, which is more important in my sense, Belgium didn't have a government for more than a year last year, but the state functioned perfectly well. This wasn't a problem at all because the huge, like justice, for instance, social security, are huge bureaucracies which can function without everyday political intervention. It just works without a government. So the necessity to find a compromise is very low in the federation. Okay, I'll stop in just a second. My main claim is that federalism was politically probably very fair, and it was an answer to the claims of both sides, but it's politically and practically a failure today, if you look at Belgium today. I think that the divorce is not, Belgium will not necessarily divorce, and there are with very few adjustments, you could probably fix this broken marriage. One, for instance, by having an overlapping consensus, which could probably be achieved by one common electoral district, which does not exist in Belgium. If you even had a third of the voters from both sides, then you would have something like an overlapping consensus in Belgium, and you don't have that. The constituencies are bounded by linguistic barriers, and there's no agenda common to both communities. And this could, constitutional patriotism, I will not talk about this. But these would be, an intermediary solution would be one overlapping electoral district to fix this, to fix it, and to have, again, these a priori coalitions that we had before the 70s instead of a posteriori deals, which are disliked by the voters. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. To make sense of all of this, which we have with us also our own Amal Jamal, who has been doing with Khani this incredible work of organizing this conference. So this is to thank you and Khani for this conference as well. And Amal, please.
Well, thank you very much, Yossi. Thank you for the 2 thought-provoking papers. It's a tough task, as a matter of fact, to make sense of them. Although I see commonalities between the 2 papers, that's what I'm going to start with. I think both papers have a different take on institutional design in divided societies. Both are committed to constitutional design in order to deal with divisions in multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multilingual societies. And they try to provide some solutions as to how to translate valuational and normative social divisions into an institutional structure. And of course, with Professor Stepan, with the comparative wide scopic comparative approach, provides a very important and interesting answers to many questions that could be raised, how to deal with divisions in such societies. And the other paper of Astrid deals with one country, but also provide a very interesting institutional answers to some of the most important questions in transitional situations where conflicts arise between different groups. And one of the most important questions in this regard that comes to mind is, can institutional structures give answers to normative disagreements? And how? In what sense? What actually motivates people to move from the normative valuational level to the institutional level in order to deal with these divisions? I think this is one of the most important questions that come to mind in such a setting. And although the institutional structures provided by both papers are very interesting, very important, and I agree with most of what has been actually said, but still, when I read the two papers, what came to my mind is how actually you motivate people to move from one place to another, or in other words, and trying to connect to papers from this afternoon and the morning also, is where do we start? I mean, the question of the beginning, how do you start this process? In what way do you start this process? And since I believe you both political scientists, that the issue of power is very important here, and there will be groups that are interested to move the process in one direction, and other groups will be interested to move it in a different direction. So how do you instigate a process that will lead to an institutional design that meets actually the parameters that you are setting in order to answer the problems we have to deal with? Or in other words, how you convince the strong group to accept compromises that will lead to such a situation. And here, another question that comes to mind, and I would like to connect my comment to neo-institutional theory, which points out two important points that are very relevant in our this context. One is that institutions are a result of power relations. Institutions are containers of power, as Gideon says. So how do you make sure that these institutions do not tend to be actually a manifestation of the existing structure of power that freezes the power relations between the two groups, or shifts the process in a direction that leads to what Astrid has described happening in Belgium, actually. And the second point that comes to mind regarding the neo-institutional theory is institutions are agents themselves that seek to promote their power, and they embody a certain worldview themselves. And we know it from different countries where when there is a breakdown in one institution, a different institution takes place. So how the dynamics between different institutions are to be instigated in order to contain the normative and valuational differences that characterize the relationship between the different groups in conflict. And here, maybe I will comment to Professor Stepan specifically, is to what extent the model you presenting in this specific paper is dynamic, actually. And you are very well known for dynamic models that try to conceive a political process as a dynamic process. To what extent this state-nation model that you're bringing in, and we'll go deeper into it in a minute, actually captures a situation that is dynamic, that is a process, and to what extent this process could be controlled. What are the guarantees that such a process will maintain the characteristics that you were talking about, and otherwise, the model you're bringing in could be conceived as, or could be understood, and I don't think that's what you mean to say, could be understood as a description of a certain reality at a certain point of time. Why India reached this model that you're talking about, and how can we make sure that what's happening in India doesn't lead to what's happening in Belgium? And I would like to challenge you on this. This is not part of your paper, of course, but I would like to hear your answers on this. I think it's very important for this group to hear. Another point that came up to mind is, of course, when the fact that you speak about differentiation between a nation-state and a state-nation. When you speak about state-nation, I don't want to speak about the nation-state. I think everybody knows much about it. But when you speak about state-nation, what is the isn't that a sort of reification of the concept? What you're providing? I mean, what you are describing, and aren't you actually accepting by what you're saying, accepting the way the nation-state have described themselves, without differentiating or without at least referring to the difference or the huge gap between the discourse of the nation-state and the reality of the nation-state? Because the fact that we speak about the nation-state doesn't mean that the nation-state is a nation-state, and we know that most of the nation-states in the world are not really nation-states. But maybe in your concept, dominant systems where one nation portrays the state in such a way in order to legitimize its own interests. State-nation is a very important comparative concept. I think. Thank you very much for not only coming but also providing some of your new work on this topic, which is I find very important. And I would like you to try and tell us more about this concept, in the sense, aren't you emphasizing the nation too much? Aren't you putting too much emphasis on the nation and turning the nation into an agent? And when you look at the Hindu, is that a nation? I mean, is that one agent? Where are the different differences? Where the differences between the different groups within the nation go? When you speak about state-nation, do you differentiate between nations that are civic and nations that are ethnic? Where is the ethnic nations go in such a model? And one another point to you, and then I move to maybe 2 points to Astrid. Like when I read the paper, I was maybe surprised, maybe I misunderstood you, and I would like you to comment on this too. Aren't you actually putting too much emphasis on the state? The state is the solution. That's what you're saying. The state is the solution for the divisiveness of society, and that we have to put our trust in the state, in the structure of the state, in an institutional design of the state. Isn't that to this Staatlichkeit model? Isn't that too dangerous? Doesn't it lead us, at least theoretically, to maybe a problematic place? And you don't differentiate actually in this context. Like when I look at the examples you brought, you spoke about Canada, you spoke about India. Canada is an immigration state. Does it play? I mean, immigration nation, immigrant nation. does it make any difference when you speak about immigrant nation vis-a-vis non-immigrant nation? What about the indigenous populations, indigenous people? Does it come into your does it play any role? And here maybe I'll move to one or two comments to Astrid. Also in terms of questions, I would like to hear your point about it. I think we ought to play or take the social contract theorists as our leaders here, and may ask a hypothetical question: what would have happened if federalization didn't take place in Belgium? What do you think would have happened? Of course, this is an unfair question because it's hypothetical, but still, I mean, looking at the current reality and the fears of separation, division, and the fear of partition, wouldn't that have happened anyway? I mean, is it a federalism to accuse? Because you seem to be countering Professor Stepan's point of view regarding federalism. And I would like to hear your point. Do you really think that federalism is not a good idea? And to what extent? And what would have happened if this didn't take place? I mean, it's very important because you have an institutional approach to analyzing the situation in Belgium, but this institutional approach, I mean, you actually show that institutionalism or institutional design for divided societies doesn't work. So what works in your point of view? Thank you very much.
I will not let you answer all of Amal's questions, I guess, today.
Thank you.
I know.
It's because you know that he have answers to all questions.
Even if I know or no, I don't know, but I think I will not. I will use the prerogative of the chair. But what I will do, because he asked so many questions, I will start with Astrid with 3 minutes of responses, and you will get 4.5 minutes of responses.
Thank you very much.
Because he asked you more.
This is like I took away 10 minutes of my original
you will get your
30
minute and a half later in a second. But just to so we will, and then we will open it up for more questions. So, so because there were so many questions here, so just because there were two tensions here. If I just remind you, one was to Al in the end whether the state is in fact the solution to all of this. That's what Amos said, and that kind of like infers into this state-nation as opposed to nation-state. And the other is to what extent, on the opposite, to what extent the state itself is the problem in that respect to the Belgian question. So that's why I said let's answer this, and then we'll move to more questions. Okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so what would have happened if the Greeks hadn't won at Marathon? I don't know, but it's a good question. I will answer this in an oblique way in 3 minutes I have, and via neo-institutionalism you talked about. I think the institutional design didn't work in Belgium, but it also depends on what you expect. I mean, federalism wasn't an a priori design; it was a pragmatical, practical answer to a social misunderstanding between two groups, and an answer to different claims from different groups. But if you look at what happened after federalization, is there more political fairness? No. Is there more social cohesion? No, on the contrary. Is there a pacification of the Belgian society? No. Has Brussels an independent sociology now? Yes, and it hadn't before. Is there more social justice? No, on the contrary, because of the independent economies of the two parts of the country, and because of the non-transfer, unlike Germany, for instance, of spillover from one land to the other. In this case, from one region to the other. Fine, that's for one. So I don't know what would have happened then if federalization was necessary. It was at least the political answer to a political problem, and it was an institutional answer to a political problem. I don't know. I think federalism. There was already administrative independence in the 30s. So actually, this is a follow-up. This is a way of implementing what already informally existed to some extent, at least for language policy. But I'm not an institutionalist person. You said that all I did was more qualitative work on the different communities. I did this for this for this conference. I can't answer your question. It's a practical answer to a political problem. And the Belgians were very good constitutional architects. I mean, the Belgian constitution is a very fine piece of work. It just socially doesn't work. It has created more uncertainty than it has created a sense of security within, at least in the southern part of the country. That was
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you for your comments. You obviously talked a lot about it, and we're going to have our Thursday meeting. I'll have a chance to talk in great detail. I'm glad I came here. Is state-nation a reification? You said it was. It's an ideal type, just like nation-state's an ideal type. And then we're in the business of talking about variations, or I've just finished an 80-page work on the multiple secularisms of modern democratic and non-democratic regimes. But it allows us, it's a valuable ideal type because very quickly you challenge it with many of the strongest assertions of liberal theory and modern democracy, and that is that only a nation-state can generate the type of identities and loyalties to only a state in Gellnerian sense that has this bowl, that's seated in this bowl. He says, that's what you need. And what does he say? If you don't have that, he said, look, you can't do very much. That's what you need for a democracy. Well, since a lot of places don't have that bowl, I think it's useful to challenge that empirical statement. It's an empirical statement. Only something closer to the nation-state pole can generate loyalties to a political enterprise. And I'm Aristotelian. I think only gods and only beasts don't need something like a state. No state, no democracy. So states are important, but then this question of can only generate the loyalties. So we just took, of our 12 long-standing federal countries, 5 are closer to the state-nation pole, and the other ones are closer to the nation-state pole. It turns out, actually, I've already given you one answer, that India has very high identity, very high trust in the center, and overall sense of pride is pretty close between the two, but marginally higher in state nations. So that is a disconfirmation of one of the most important theoretical arguments about nation states. Also, another question about nation states is the state the solution, and what's the nation? Because you virtually accuse me of making too much out of the nation and too much of the state. I need both. But we've transformed the definition of a nation from one community to be able to contain 5, 6, 20 different communities, and it's got 22 different official languages. It's got all of those religions. But what we're talking about is multiple and complementary identity. Are you Indian? Yes, I'm Indian. Are you Tamil? Yes, I'm Tamil. So that's the multiple and complementary identities with the common political endeavor. That was created over 100 years by the Congress Party. It's an extraordinary thing. But again and again in historical moments, you had major moments. You had, for instance, Gandhi, 1922, first time he's the president of the Congress Party in Chennai, Madras. He says, hey, we're sitting here talking, and we're talking in 2 languages, Hindi and English, and there's only about 5% of the people in this entire region that speak those languages. And we're calling ourselves a social mobilization, liberation movement. We can't manage ourselves. People have to be able to speak the language to manage themselves. So they're going to have that. So in that sense, there were a lot of moments where they created this sense of an India, which was very important. So by the Nehru Constitution of 27, draft Constitution, many of the things that it should be federal, that it should not have an established church, that it should have many languages, were already there. So they did a lot of things. Okay. We
will go for...
I'll just say one thing about power.
Okay.
One thing about power. Political scientists...
Say it powerfully.
Political scientists focus too much on power as power over. That's what Robert Dahl's entire book about who governs is about. Power over. Okay. You can all sorts of power. Power to create non-issues. That's much more powerful than winning an open contestation. Or occasionally power too. Power is not always a positive-sum game. You can have a set of social relations that are totally a zero-sum game. Many countries that are stateless, that's a zero-sum power relationship. Or you create power. You've got to create power in order to live together. I just want to say that this incredibly poor country had the second highest growth rate in the last 30 years in the world after China. All right? And it's still holding together in a democracy, so they created more power to live collectively than they had before. So I think when we talk about power, it's not only who's got power over, is do some types of configurations develop capacity to create power and identities. They've created identities to this new community, which we'll call that's the nation part of Statenation, and they created a reasonably effective state, that's the state part. But the identity is not with a nation, it's with many, many cultures that are part of this community.
Thank you. Okay, now we have many hands and we have some time, so we will do this. You will ask questions and we will collect them, and then we will collect the questions so you will write them down, and Astrid also, so we will collect the questions. The first round will be Professor Arato, Chaim Gantz, Moshe, and Professor Mazzini. And then the second round, I have also some hands here, so I have you in the second round. So Professor Arato first.
These are excellent talks, but I would not draw the line where Al drew it. I think the question is, in most of these cases, not between nation-state and state-nation, but between symmetrical and asymmetrical federation. That's the real question. Mm-hmm. In Iraq, where I studied, which I did study, that was the question. Symmetrical federation or asymmetrical federation. And of course, then the subsequent question is what kind of power of the center, what kind of finances, and all these other things that come on top of it. So this is the question, and I think the burden of your thesis is to show that asymmetrical federation is what works, the asymmetrical part that works. And here, don't come up with Canada, which has the best borders in the world, great natural resources, not a lot of people, and all the rest. I mean, we saw Belgium, which is pretty favorable in terms of giving. And Spain could be added too. And the situation is not great. So I think you have the burden is to show that the asymmetrical part is what works. I thought, and I debated Peter Galbraith on this, he should be in jail, but that's another matter.
Not because of this debate.
Not because of the debate. She lost, but it doesn't matter because he won the case. He won the actual thing.
Yeah.
He did it.
Uh-huh.
He did the asymmetrical federacy, by the way, over there. And it created untold trouble, and how many Americans died also and Iraqis because of it. But it doesn't matter because he's now has $150 million that he made on it. But in any case, that's not, obviously not the fault of last year. But the point is that the asymmetrical part, doesn't mean that there's a majority of somebody in a province. That's almost naturally true. There's going to be more of somebody than somebody else. The asymmetrical thing means you bring everybody you bring all the majority provinces together in a region. That's the central demand of the people who want asymmetrical federation. They want all the Kurds together in a Kurdish region, all the Basques together. This, I think, by its nature, centrifugal.
Yes.
By its nature, centrifugal. You can compensate for it. Now, I don't know India, and there are people here, really several, who really know India. But my thesis would be is that this was not done in the beginning, A. B, the central state was extremely strong. And because of that starting point, it could later on put up with some asymmetrical elements later on. But basically, basically the thing is symmetrical. Basically, it's a powerful central state. It intervenes in the states over and over again. I'd like to see the Iraqi state intervene in Kurdistan,
Yes.
in Kashmir. So I think the burden would be to show that asymmetrical part works and don't come up with Canada, on which most of these theories are based, because we're suffering from a Canadian disease, which shouldn't be perpetuated anymore, because that's a country which has absolutely the best borders. It's rich, and it has natural resources and a small population. So I think we should probably turn somewhere else for our inspiration.
That's a very important point here, and we don't have any Canadian here to defend Canada, but
I think I was inspired by Canada.
Yes.
It's a damn thing about Canada. Mention it.
Yes.
Well, another point regarding the possible difference in the dynamics and interplay of factors affecting these matters are the historical relationship among the various groups in the country. I was just teaching Kimika's multicultural odyssey now, and he speaks there about the failure of disseminate or diffusing, because liberal multiculturalism to the post-communist and post-colonial parts of the world. And one of the main factors you mentioned there is the fact that in multinational or multi-ethnic states, such as Sri Lanka and post-communist world, the minorities usually have, the majorities have historical
Account. Settling accounts.
Settling accounts with the minority who belong to previous majorities who dominated them, and or in the case of Sri Lanka, the Tamils I read in history were collaborating with the British colonials, and this is part of the explanation for what has developed, what you have described. One of the things that has developed in Sri Lanka, as opposed to there was no reason for such developments regarding the relation between the Tamils in India and the rest of India. So the question is, how do you take all these historical factors into your...
So we have two issues here, the asymmetrical issues and the historical issues. Yes.
I'm wondering if there's a real difference between nation-state and state-nation. I mean, you said there are political identities complementary, so there is an overall cultural identity. If there is an overall cultural dominant identity, you have a nation. And I don't see so.
That's why I have the word state-nation.
Yes, I don't see how you.
But it's multiple. It can be multiple cultures.
Yes, but
multiple languages, multiple religions.
Yes, but how can you escape the Gilnerian oxymoron? That's the problem. Because if you come to a new democracy, where you have several competing low cultures, and you have to create, in order to create a nation, you have to give the dominance to a certain, or to elevate a certain culture, or to develop a certain culture. A certain kind of homogenization is unavoidable. In order to, if you accept that the nation, to any extent, is the Gilnerian model, I mean, there is a need of a certain kind of homogenization. So how do you solve the problem? You have to impose a culture eventually.
You can create a culture. I mean, the Gandhi example is culture creation over time. Social mobilization, participation.
It refers to a certain culture. I mean, the Indian, I believe that there is a dominance in the Indian culture to the Hindu, because they are the majority. I mean, you cannot escape.
Okay. Also, what helped Gandhi eventually, there was like some huge population exchange. So you cut the story of homogenization very quickly.
And 140 million people there.
That's a lot.
Even Armenians in Greece.
Still, okay.
140 million Muslims.
Okay, go ahead.
And my question to you is, what you portray is actually not a nation state. I mean, and is there a Belgian identity? I mean, do the Belgians identify themselves as a nation?
Okay, the last in this last round, Professor Mancini.
Yeah, I have a specific Belgian question. Astrid, do you think that one of the major reasons for the failure of Belgian federalism is that the Belgian constitution ended up by containing two completely contradictory constitutional projects that actually correspond to different, not only constitutional identities, but also to different philosophies. And then typically the French way to think about the people as a political identity, which is reflected in the creation of the regions, and the Flemish kind of German ethnocentric understanding of the people, which is reflected in the creation of the community. And the level of contradiction is so high that the system cannot function because the disharmony is just unmanageable. And the second point is, you asked the question, is Belgium still a constitutional democracy? My question is, does Belgium still have a constitution? Because this is a completely parity, I mean, it's a parity structure according to which either the two groups find some level of compromise or this one. So it looks more like a compact between states in the language of Cahoon rather than a constitution over there.
I think all the questions, in fact, with the exception perhaps of the last one, is for both. So we will start with Astrid. You have your minute and a half from last time, plus 4 now. Okay.
Ooh, that's too much.
Generosity is all over the place, yes.
I think you're completely right about the two philosophies. Although in the Belgian constitution there is a provision for the French to do exactly as the Flemish did, to merge the communities and the region. But you're right, and that's history. I mean, that's World War II history, the collaboration of the Flemish part, the traditional Catholic Völkisch North, and the socialist unionist, not liberal, but socialist Republican South, which actually after World War II voted I can't find the English word, to join France, and de Gaulle called for the Walloon part to join France. So it's two completely different visions of a nation, and that's also the answer to your question. And actually, the French Republican, centralistic, patriotic Republican, although it's a monarchy version of the nation, was predominant throughout the whole Belgian history. And even the Flemish movement was a patriotic movement in the first place. It asked for cultural rights, very few of them, and it was and defended Belgium, was Belgian patriotic, Unitarian patriotic, and it was paradoxically because of the French Republican view of the South that the Flemish part became more and more aggressive, because the French-speaking government refused to accede to the claims of the Flemings. So eventually it became this. Plus, there's another argument also, which is that, and it has to do with this is not the Marxist lecture of Belgian history, but there has been a complete upside downing of economy in Belgium. The southern part, because of the coal mines, was the richest part until the 20s, 30s, and even until the 50s, and now it's the Flemish part which is the richest. So the bargaining has also to do, of course, with the economic wealth badly distributed between the north and the south. So is there a Belgian identity? Yes, and that's very funny, because the polls show that the Belgians, although most of them, when you ask them, do you feel Belgian, Flemish, from Brussels, from Antwerp, from West and from the coast, or more from the... Most of, I think 3 point something out of 5 answer Belgium, Belgian identity. Those are the polls you also have, right, Al? Yeah. That they feel Belgian first, but that doesn't mean anything in their practical everyday life when they go to the supermarket and have to deal with the Walloon part of the community. So this is why polls are, this is not qualitative, this is quantitative. Quantitatively, Belgians feel Belgium.
Please.
Lots of hard issues. Andrew said that the Indian state was powerful to begin with. That's absolutely right. We talk about this at great length in the book. It didn't have this hollowing out. Belgium was in the middle. If we're looking at Yugoslavia and the USSR, major hollowing out, particularly in Yugoslavia, in the post-Tito constitution. very little hollowing out in India. So they, now, this means, does asymmetrical federalism, can it carry some weight? It partly carries weight because it's working together with the center. The center is worried about how it can manage a civil war, say, in Mizoram. It lasted for 15 years. This is a group, less than 5% of the population, it's in northeast India, less than 5% of the Mizos speak Hindi, and only 3% are Hindus. Okay? They were fighting a war for independence. They couldn't win, but the Indian government recognized that they never could defeat them, and they recognized they could never defeat. So you had a hurting stalemate. And the agreement was asymmetrical federalism. We're going to get a huge amount of asymmetry. No one can vote for a local election here if they're not Mizo, gulp. So this is it's not a static model. It can create new things. It's a 4 or 5 level federalism which have been created in the context. So the Mizos, you have to be a Mizo to vote in a local election. Only Mizos can own land. Because they said, look, if we just go in and we're poor, we're going to be taken over. So that was built into it. You couldn't possibly do that in a symmetrical system. Where is Mizoram now? Mizoram now, by every scale, is without a doubt the most peaceful place in any place in the Northeast. And it is the highest identity with the rest of India, even though they're less than 5% Hindu-speaking or so on. It's amazing. They feel that they're part, but they see it. When I talk to the chief minister, who had been the vice chairman of the Revolutionary Army, he's now the chief minister, he says, hey, you know what I have here? I've got a nation state. People are always kind of saying, you've got a nation state. Well, it's a very small nation state, and I'm part of the European Union, which is India. So it's a way of looking at things. Now, that's asymmetrical federalism. They won all sorts of things that didn't exist anywhere else. Okay, so asymmetrical federalism is crucial to arranging this. I mean, India created a whole, the American federalism is coming together federalism where people retain as much of their sovereignty as possible and only pool what they need. This is a different type of, this is holding together federalism. The center creates it, nobody has, and then in terms of residual powers, crucial constitutional issue, residual powers are with the center. In Switzerland, in Australia, in the United States, residual powers are with the states. And does history have consequences? Bloody well it has consequences. If you take a look at veto players, if you're a unitary state that has that's bicameral and parliamentary, you only have one veto player. That's the majority in the lower house. If you're bicameral and the upper house can do it, you can have 2, or if you're semi-presidential. If you're Switzerland, you've got 4 veto players. The United States has 4 veto players, and Australia has 4 veto players. Then you take a look at social welfare, passage of social welfare, and inequality. Without a doubt, for the last 30 years, the 3 most unequal and the greatest income distributions are the 3 coming together federal systems that have retained all their powers. And so it's hard to create a federal. It's hard to create, as you've seen in the United States right now, a nationwide health system or a nationwide welfare system. So history has its consequences. On Belgium, I think there are some things there. People do have some funny identities. One of the identities is nobody wants to lose Brussels. If Flanders is going to become independent, since only 13% of the people in Brussels speak Flemish, what do you think the vote would be in Brussels whether they're going to join Flanders or not? They're not going to join it. And then, so Flanders is going to have to divorce themselves from Brussels. This is another set of complications. They gain a lot by being part of that. So it's a complex identity. It's still on a 5-point scale. The modal identity is still number 3. It's weakened. And that's rather interesting. I mean, even in Flanders. And but also it's not quite as this is not quite as hollowed out in functions. Mm-hmm. When you take a look at say 20 important state functions, a lot of them in terms of money and tax and so on and defense are still at the center.
We have, according to our organizers here, we have 4 minutes left. And so what we will do, we'll take There were people who were eager to ask questions. I don't know if you will get answers, but you certainly want to raise your voice. Would you like to raise your voice, Alberto? What? You sure? Stand up so we'll see you also.
We did start 20 minutes late, though.
No, they want to go to the restaurant.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
But I don't think you have done some kind of comparative research regarding rules, especially the question that you mentioned, economic question, which is regarding the question of evolution. There are some situations where you have evolution, it's complex. It's in Belgium the same thing, because the same argument works for Catalonia, exactly the one.
Italy.
Pay taxes to see.
Even Italy in Unitarian states.
The Lega Nord, the Italy, they also want some kind of, separation because of money. And the Basque, actually, they want separation for different reasons because they have the money themselves. They don't pay taxes to Spain. And that's my question.
Thank you. Michael, last question.
Yeah. Puerto Rico asymmetrical federalism is a West Midlothian question. I'm concerned about asymmetrical federalism, which I think Professor Rato might have been pointing to, is that people use in the province, they use their power at the center for the benefit of their province at the expense of everybody else. One solution to that, you might say, is the U.S. is an asymmetrical federation. Don't give that province any power at the center, and then they can't misuse it. Under what circumstances is that a reasonable solution, and under what circumstances is that an unreasonable solution? Puerto Rican situation seems stable.
Oh, but if you mean in federalism, you give no power to the state, is that a reasonable solution for federalism? No.
So Puerto Rico can't work.
Puerto Rico.
Why is that stable, Puerto Rico and the U.S.?
It's obviously stable for a long article about it. It's obviously stable because if people join the United States, which a majority of them say they would like to, then they have to pay taxes and they don't want to. Then a lot of them are very, very Spanish, and if they join the United States, it's not clear Spanish would be the official language anymore. So they say, hey, we're in a pretty good place. So I've quit following it because those tensions are there. But it's totally wrong. LSR calls it a federacy. It's not a federacy. It's a special relationship. No, I understand why they don't want to vote either to become independent or to become. It's strange. They're pained by it that they don't vote to become either a state or independent, but they're going to stay where they are.
You have the last word.
Okay, I want to answer Alberto's question. We'll do this over coffee, but just that there is a plan to create. This is actually a follow-up on what Al said. To create a federation within the federation, which would Brussels-Wallonia, which would make the secession of Flanders very much easier. So the Flemings are against this federation that the Walloons and the Brussels want to create, either Brussels as a Stadtstaat within Europe, or a federation within the federation, and then the Flemings would let go of Brussels. They wouldn't, of course.
Thank you so much for our speakers, for Amal, and for abiding by the clock, which is.
Hey, when you get close to drinks, you abide by the clock.
For all guests.